Thank you, Aisha. And thank you everybody so much for coming. It's really lovely to see the place so full, in fact slightly more than full. I want to start with some thanks. The first thanks, of course, is P21. Every year there are our generous, kind hosts. And thank you for that. And then, of course, the Memo team, without which we, of course, wouldn't be here. Makam Books, who have kindly organized the bringing of the books and the selling of them. So it's one task that we've managed to shift onto somebody else, which is very, very good. Thank you, Makam. Then, of course, the wonderful authors who you will hear from. And the publishers. I think there are quite a lot of publishers here. And thank you so much for everything you've chosen. All the books are fantastic. And you've done a great job. And the last people I have to thank are the judges. This year, they had more than 80 books. I am so glad I wasn't a judge. It's really an amazing job that they've had to do. So thank you all for all your work. So, as last year, Aisha's going to open the evening with a prayer for the many thousands of martyrs of this genocide in Gaza and the West Bank by the Israeli government and military forces. And also for the 9,250 prisoners held by Israel, including 450 children and 80 women, and the 3,389 who are held in administrative detention without charge or without trial. So, Aisha.
Basically, if you want to stand for a moment of silence,
Can you stand?
or if you want to read the Fatiha on their souls, as the majority of them are Muslim, you can also do that. Thank you. I think we're done.
So now I'm going to talk to each of the authors, ask them a few questions about their books, and then you'll have plenty of time to ask some questions yourselves. And then at the end, about maybe around 8:30, we'll just mingle and buy books and go into the cafe, and the cafe will stay open for us. So again, thank you for being with us. Okay. I'm going to hold the books up because there are so many. I want you to know the book we're talking about. So this is the first book, The Hollow Half, and the author is on my right, Sarah. So Sarah Aziza has written a memoir, which is very unusual for somebody of your age. And what it seemed to me to be, it's like a love letter to your grandma, and also to your father. And I want to say something about the different ways you saw your grandmother when you were living in America and when you were living in Saudi, and in your dreams. Can you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, for hosting all of us, and for inviting so many wonderful folks into this room for a discussion. It's truly an honor to be here. I can't imagine a greater honor than to have my book be associated with something with the name Palestine. So your question is, how did I see my grandmother? Wow, okay. Yes, it is unusual for someone of my age to write a memoir. It's actually still mortifying to use the word memoir, but I'm grateful that you saw in your reading that it's not really a book in which I try to, strictly speaking, cover the story of my life, but rather use my life as a lens and a vehicle, to sort of bring the reader along on my own journey of waking up as a young woman and realizing that the loss of Palestine was not only external but internal. It was a loss that I suffered and also in some ways inflicted on myself through the experience of diaspora, through the terrible trade that is assimilation, because I was born in the US and moved around, but unfortunately didn't live in Palestine but 3 months. So along that journey, it really began with a dream that I had of my grandmother, who by then had passed away. Her name is Victoria Brittain. And it was this really mystical experience, honestly, of feeling her presence so profoundly, and from then being sparked to, not only recover every memory I had of her, which involved just a lot of intimacy as a little child. She lived with us in Chicago, and then we moved to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and I saw her frequently there. And in so many ways, she, as a young girl, just embodied this sense of home and comfort and viscerality and just sort of like embodiedness that by the time I was a young woman growing up in the West, I had lost all of those things. But of course, my grandmother was also so much more than that, and I think that's what ends up kind of like creating the current in the book. Is she was also a triple, 3-time refugee. She also raised children in Gaza. She was also displaced from Gaza. She lost a child. She suffered heartbreak of the most ordinary kind, as well as the most geopolitical. And we became estranged, or not estranged, but we grew into very different types of women towards the end. And but I realized, through my journey, I guess, of getting to know her through research, through oral history, I just lost. Is this still on?
Nassim?
Maybe she's here.
Enough about me, she said.
Yeah, exactly. I'm happy to shout or just be done. Okay. Oh, okay. All right, that might have been my fault. I'm trying to speak more generally because the book is a really... how did I do? I think it might be low on battery. There's a red light. Would you like me to pause or just talk from my chest?
I think...
Can I project? I can project.
I think you can project. How are you at the back for hearing us?
Can you hear me?
Oh, everyone's got their thumb up. Go ahead.
It's technically an accessibility issue, but if most of us can hear, we'll go on. I'm speaking very generally because the book is really crafted in a structurally in a very unusual way. It's kind of hard to put down, I guess in a quick summary, but there's layers of personal discovery that map on, I discover, to my grandmother's life, that also maps on to the story of Palestine, that also allows me to come into a new understanding and intimacy with my father. And I come to find out the ways that we've all erased ourselves as refugees and folks in the diaspora. I guess I would say I come to see through my grandmother a type of resilience, but also a type of softness and brokenness. I think that a lot gets lost in the story of refugees and our grandparents and our parents. In many ways, I was told to just enjoy the fact that I was a lucky daughter that got to have the privilege of an American passport. That I was lucky because I didn't need to know the details of Nexa, things like that, but that these histories actually, thank you. Okay, now I feel like it's so loud. These histories are in our bodies and in our spirits, whether we acknowledge them or not, and so it's really a journey of recognizing that erasure can come from within and without, and learning to embrace the complexities of being a Palestinian in the diaspora, a Palestinian that believed my father at first when we came to the US, and he told me to be grateful and to be well behaved. My journey also includes learning from my grandmother a sense of stubbornness and a type of more passionate living that does encompass breaking, that does encompass, I guess, sort of resisting. The book also does cover the way that I learned to start, in many ways drawing on her strength and on the fact of the enduring injustice that her life represents, to become someone who does my best to bring Palestine into the room wherever I go, to presence it, to hold her, to hold not only the beauty and the strength that she embodied, but also the fact that there were things that broke her, and there were ways in which she was failed in her lifetime, and those ripple effects are now mine to recognize and hold with tenderness. It means that I recognize that I carry wounds and that I also carry many, many gifts. So I guess, again, I'm trying to speak a bit abstractly to your question, but now I truly feel like I do see her every day. Just in the fact that I know who I come from, and that tells me everything about the direction of my life and what principles I want to carry and live by. And the last thing I'll say is the second half of the book I wrote after October 7th, 2023, and I try to make the case for the most, I try to make the case that the highest act of love can be resistance and be fighting. It's just, this world is not fit for most of us to live in. This is a world that's built for most of our grandmothers and all of our bodies collectively to suffer and be erased and diminished. So I guess that what I hope the book most leaves with people is a sense of their own humanity and tether to history and place, and that drives them to embrace a kind of love that makes them brave and makes them fighters, because that's ultimately what I think my grandmother's legacy is challenging me to be, and that's what I work towards every day.
Thank you so much. That was really great. You're very brave. I mean, when you buy the book and read it, you'll see just how brave was the journey that she went on. Let me turn to you, Dina. This Dina Matar, Professor Dina Matar, in fact. She is the author of book number 2. It looks like that. Oh yeah, thank you.
Here, I have long arms.
It's called Producing Palestine. And I wanted to ask you, what was the spark which led you to this, you and your co-editor, to this concept of production as what you wanted to be the center of the book? Start with that.
Thank you so much. So I must say my co-editor, Dr. Helga Tawil-Souri, is in New York and couldn't make it. But it would have been wonderful to have her. So the book, why production? I mean, we both come from this interdisciplinary field of media studies, where we try and think of, okay, why are people using media? And what brought us together is a kind of continuation of what I call a journey into understanding what it means to be Palestinian, which is my bugbear. I keep thinking about it, it comes back to haunt me, which is the title of my first single-authored book. And the idea that came to us is that we were, at the time of thinking of the book, it was around just after COVID, we were thinking, well, how can we address that temporality of production? Because we could see there were so many incredible creative works, whether it's through film, whether it's through poster art, whether it's through visual narratives and other forms of production, whether it is through using your mobile telephone to produce something, to produce an image or an idea, and in other words, to tell a story. And so we were thinking, okay, so how are we going to try and address that moment? And we didn't want to come to it from kind of the very restrictive scope of media studies, because media studies can kind of push you in a particular direction, where you always have to think about this notion of representation or misrepresentation. And of course we all know that, we all know, and we keep repeating it, that Palestinians have been and continue to be misrepresented, they continue to be erased out of history, and et cetera, et cetera. And we wanted to think about this moment or this period of production in its various forms. So we weren't committed to looking at one form. We wanted to look at how people engage with different forms. You have examples of that out there. And we thought, okay, it was a moment, as we write in the book, it was a moment when Palestinians, we felt, no longer needed the permission to narrate, which is what Edward Said talked about in 1984 in one of his most famous kind of articles, permission to narrate. Palestinians need to narrate, they need to talk, but they're always constrained by questions about, do you have the legitimacy to talk about yourselves, or can you talk about yourselves? Do you have the right to talk about yourselves? So we felt it was a moment of production that went beyond the permission to narrate. As we ended the book, and so we have different chapters, and again, one of the things that, looking back at it, so we, how we approached it, is that we didn't want to be very prescriptive in understanding production. We wanted to think about it coming out of, organic, creative gestures by various people, and also by the authors in the book. How do they think about the notion of production? What does it mean for them? So we wanted to theorize production in the end, which we hope we have done. Now, what happened is that as we were finishing the book, of course, October 7th happened. And, that kind of brought us back to the beginning, which is the idea of permission to narrate. And again, the questions about permission to narrate came to haunt us, as the question of representation as well, and the crisis of representation. Who represents whom? Who is allowed to represent who talks for the Palestinians, and so on. And these were really difficult questions to untangle, and we felt almost defeated, like, what is this book about? What is it going to do? Because we are at a moment when we're almost back to ground zero, if I can use that, which is the name of the film, obviously. That came out of Gaza. So we were, we were at a stage where we thought, oh my God, what we have done does not make any sense. But we again pushed ourselves out, and we realized that there is a need to keep producing, there is a need to keep narrating and talking, and there are different ways of doing it. But at the center of that production is Palestine. Whichever way it is imagined, at the center of it is the idea, is the imagination of return. So return does run through, the concept of return. How is return imagined in these productions? How do people talk about return? And then again, the idea of imagination coming through very ordinary, banal activities like cooking, or even just kind of producing figures and for example, there's a chapter on different visual, artistic presentations of the kufiya going through the ages, how it was used and so on. So it's not your normal academic book, but it is academic to a certain extent. It is about engaging with this idea of production as an act that Palestinians could have and continue to be engaged with, to show that they have agency and that they can speak for themselves. I hope that explains it.
Thank you. And we'll be able to come back with more questions once we've had one go all around. Okay, so can I give you that for a second? The next book is this one. Daybreak in Gaza. Oh, thank you. There's the author holding it up. So I think you've all seen it now. Matthew, can I start by asking you about to tell us about your co-editor?
I'm so glad you asked.
The Jerusalem bookseller and writer Mahmoud Muna.
Love him. Round of applause is for Mahmoud as well. Yeah. Thank you for asking me, Victoria. Mahmoud should be here. I wish he was here. He's in Jerusalem at the moment. He is an extraordinary person, and it's been a privilege of mine to count him as a friend for, we don't actually know how long, it's like 10 years, or more than 10 years that we've known each other. He runs the educational bookshop in Jerusalem, which is a family-run business. I'm going to steal some of his stories just to introduce him to this audience. He tells the story about his father, who he's still with us. He was a teacher at an UNRWA school in the Shafat refugee camp in Jerusalem for 39 years. And he used to teach the boys' shift in the morning from 6 till 12. And then the same school buildings, because of the pressures obviously that are there, the same school building reverts to a girls' school between 12 and 6 in the afternoon. So he would teach in the morning, and then he had his afternoons free. And Mahmoud tells a story about how he wanted to read books. He wanted to have some time for himself to read, so in order to do that, he started a bookshop business, so that he could spend his afternoons in his bookshop reading books and occasionally selling them, which he did very well. Mahmoud was not exactly born in the bookshop, but he first went to the bookshop, he says, when he was 2 months old, which was just when his father was starting that business. He basically grew up in the bookshop, and now he and his family runs it. It's a beacon of Palestinian cultural fixity in Jerusalem that has perhaps inevitably come under attack. This year in particular, it's been raided twice this year by the Israeli police. Mahmoud and his nephew earlier in February this year were both arrested and spent time in prison, completely unjustified. Obviously, they were originally charged with incitement to violence for the crime of selling books. And even in the Israeli so-called justice system, that didn't wash, and the charges were very, very quickly taken down to violating public order by selling books, and it's hard to tell which one is worse, but anyway. That was an extremely traumatic experience for Mahmoud and for his nephew as well, and for other family members too, and they've been in recovery, if you like, this year because of it. This book came about early in the genocide. I, for my sins, am related or affiliated with media and publishing in this country. And in the first few weeks and couple of months after the beginning of the genocide, I was looking around and waiting for a response from British publishing, British media, a call of outrage or a call of resistance or something, and there was absolute silence. There was nothing coming at all. and Mahmoud and I were talking a lot, as we do all the time anyway. And he was also in touch with people in Gaza as well, and moving beyond the point of asking people, how are you? You can't ask people in that situation, if you're in touch with them on WhatsApp or by the phone or whatever, how are you? It's an unanswerable question. And so those questions began to move into, tell me more about your life, tell me more about what's happening to you, or what did happen to you, or how you used to spend your days, or where you used to go. Slowly sort of evoking stories. And between us, we developed the idea, which turned into this book, of being able to platform the voices of people from Gaza and people who are associated with Gaza, to tell those stories, to preserve a moment under the bombardment that would keep Gaza and Gaza present, keep Gazan culture and Gazan identity present, even in the midst of the destruction. And we were joined by also another inspiring person who should be here, Juliet Touma. She's the global communications director for UNRWA, who has worked a lot in Gaza, works a lot as well in Gaza, has many, many contacts. We also were joined by Jayob Abu Safia, who's a journalist, London-based journalist who was born and brought up in Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza as well. Each of us were activating our networks, if you like, trying to see who was in a position to be able to share stories, who was in the mental space to be able to share stories as well. And obviously trying to be as sensitive as you could possibly be in those situations, expecting perhaps that people might be reticent, or people might be absorbed with survival and unable to share stories. We found quite the opposite, that people were desperate to be heard and people were desperate to share stories. And once the connection was made, we came under a tsunami of stories coming from Gaza, from all sorts of people. We were talking initially to writers and artists, but also we wanted, and we were able, very luckily, to be able to draw stories from the breadth of Gaza's social mix, farmers and school teachers and students and shop workers and office workers and people who are unconnected with politics, who are maybe involved with the theatre or involved with, I don't know, whatever. But to draw these stories and to be able to platform that idea of Gaza as a living place. We had a lot of pushback from publishers in the UK. We eventually found an amazing outlet through Saki, who are very well known, obviously, in this environment. A small independent publisher in London with a long track record of fiction and non-fiction from the Middle East in particular. Where other publishers were pushing back and resisting and saying that we don't know who's going to buy this, there's no market, we can't sell this. Saki understood the moral urgency of acting quickly straight away. So it was extraordinary to be able to draw the expertise of Mahmoud in particular, and also Juliet, and also Jaya, and to have it shepherded through by Saki as well. I lost my train a little bit in that, but it's been a remarkable experience for me. The last year of working with Mahmoud in particular has been a process of learning which I will never forget.
Thanks very much. I just want to add something about Mahmoud.
Please.
A story which involves PBA. In the first year of PBA, we had this book, which in fact became one of the winners. And I was in Bethlehem when we shortlisted it. And I thought it would be nice to meet the author, the co-author, and tell him face to face, you've been shortlisted. So I asked my friends, how can I find him? Oh, they said, go to the education bookshop. So I arrived in the education bookshop where there were piles and piles and piles of this book. And I asked Mahmoud, how could I'm from England, and we've just started a book prize, and he's been shortlisted. And he looked at me rather like, really? I said, is it possible to meet him? So he said to his nephew, maybe, go see if he's in his shop, and he'll come. Anyway, 10 minutes later, he comes back, practically dusting his hands down from whatever he'd been doing. And I explained about the being shortlisted. And those days, our shortlists were short. Anyway, he said, well, that's very nice of you to come, and thank you very much. And then on the day when we had the awards, the co-writer is a woman some of you may know. She's the most amazing activist called Jen Marlowe. And this is a prison story. That's the main thing about it. And Jen, with her laptop, was in the room where we were having the dinner. And she opened her laptop and got him on the phone, or it was like a Zoom. So I could see that his whole family was around him. And she kept turning it around to show him the group. And then she kept saying to him, we've won. And he was like, what, hey? Anyway, it was a very kind of domestic, intimate experience. And that was our first PBA. And I've always really treasured what he did to make that. Anyway, this is not up for anything except do buy it. It's a wonderful book. So now we're moving into a very different era. It's about guilty Britain. You'll all enjoy this. The book. Can you hold it up for me? Of course, yeah. So, Policy of Deceit by Peter Stambrook. And it's 1914 to 1939. And my first question to you is, what gave you this very clever idea of focusing 35 years of history, with the devastating consequences we see today, on 10 letters written between July the 14th, 1915, and the following March, and an additional one in the following October, between Sheriff Hussein of Mecca and Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Cairo?
I just need a couple of hours, that's all. I'm surprised to be here, and grateful to be here, very grateful. I grew up, my mother came from Irish Republican Ireland, and my dad was very English, so I grew up knowing that always that there were, and listening to two very different national narratives. That was the first thing. And then during the 70s and 80s, can you not hear me? During the 70s and 80s, I spent some time in Egypt, and I was in Beirut briefly in the middle of the Civil War in 82, and so on, and spent some years teaching. When it came to the book, I wasn't planning to write a book 10 years ago, but a small group of people was starting something called the Balfour Project, which is now the Britain-Palestine Project. And because of my history background, they were planning to ask the whole question about how should the Balfour Declaration be, centenary be celebrated or mourned or just commemorated in Britain in 2017. So they were holding a series of conferences. They asked me to give 20 minutes on Britain and the so-called contradictory promises. So that was the basic start of it. First World War. And I'd already done sort of decades of reading all this sort of standard stuff of Albert Hourani and El-Kurd and so on beforehand. Basically, all the promises that were made, you know, the Constantinople, the Sykes-Picot, Balfour Declaration, Anglo-French Declaration of 1918, etc. They all have their they're all pretty straightforward. I mean, they're pretty awful morally and so on and so forth. But the thing that intrigued me about Hussein McMahon was that, and the correspondence of 1915, and was that mainstream historians like Albert Hourani, who I met, God bless him, Albert and other mainstream historians, what I would call ideologically mainstream historians, if there is such a thing, on this issue, on this very contentious issue, basically sat on the fence in terms of Hussein McMahon and whether or not Palestine region had been promised to the Sharif in this famous letter of 24th of October 1915. You had your Eli Kaduris and your Isaiah Friedmans and other pro-Zionist historians and Sir Martin Gilbert and so on, who said that Palestine was definitely not promised, and you had one or two other people, including Rashid Khalidi recently, who said Palestine was promised. So that was the one promise that I felt intrigued about, and so I went into the archives and started looking at the National Archives in Kew through the Colonial Office, Foreign Office, and Cabinet Office records. And to cut a long story short, it was like a little rat's tail. It was a kind of mystery. I wasn't looking for deceit or deception or perfidy, although I'd heard a lot about it from all the different books and various historians I talked to. But the more I investigated these British records, I spent about a year in the archives, and at the end of that year, I came out more confused than when I went in, quite frankly. But eventually the British game, eventually emerged. And instead of getting a sort of 5 or 10 page academic article out of it, I found myself more and more intrigued. So I ended up going through most, I don't know whether, I haven't been through all, but most of the Cabinet records, Foreign Office, Colonial Office records dealing with Palestine between 1914 and 1939. The reason I stopped in 1939 was because in 1920, the question of the correspondence and the question of Palestine was raised in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and Lord George's government at the time refused to publish the correspondence. All the other things had been published. The correspondence was not. So that intrigued me, and I ended up with 10,000 photographs of relevant British, foreign, colonial, and Cabinet Office records between 1914 and 1939. The reason I stopped in 1939 was because between 1920 and 1939, the British government in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords officially refused requests to publish the correspondence. They used a variety of explanations, justifications. It was not in the public interest. That was the most general thing they used. So that was. But in 1939, because they needed to placate the Arab world and they didn't want a repeat of World War I with the Ottomans or the Turks going over to join Mussolini and Hitler, etc., they needed to stabilise. So they were slightly more open to the idea of the request of publishing the correspondence, which they did. But they still, although they published it, they then continued to deny that Palestine was promised to the Sheriff in 1939. By this time, I was absolutely clear, having looked at all the correspondence was in Arabic, all the 10 letters between Cairo and Mecca were all in Arabic, but then they were translated and they were mistranslated as well. So anyway, so that's why I stopped in 1939. But the bigger picture, which is more important than a broken promise in a sense, although a broken promise is still, it was pretty awful because it was all part of us kickstarting the whole thing, while we're here today, with this Balfour Declaration. Just to mention the other thing I did, which kind of solidified the whole thing, was I decided to look at the Hansard, what the British were saying publicly between 1920 and 1939 during this period. So I spent 6 months in front of my computer and I went through every single day of parliamentary sittings, between June of 1916, which is when the Zionists and Weizmann started talking to senior British officials about the Balfour Declaration, and December 1939. And I pulled out all the debates and questions in Parliament about Palestine and the correspondence and the mandate and so on. And I cut, pasted and printed it out, and it comes to about 1.4 million words. And so I had in one hand I had the Foreign Office records, what they were saying privately, not just about the correspondence, but everything else. And in my other hand, I had what they were saying publicly, what the different governments were saying publicly, and the gap between them. And in the middle, I had Albert Harani and Avi Schleim and Eli Khaduri and everything else. So I endeavoured to tell the truth. But Palestine was definitely promised to the Sharif. Okay, definitely promised. And the interesting, well, have I got another minute, Tom?
Of course you have.
The promise was in a letter. I'm sure you know all this anyway. You know the background and the context, which is so important. Okay, the Sharif was promised an extensive, very extensive Arab independent state if they revolted, and they did eventually. June the 8th or 9th, 1916, they revolted. The Arabs did. They committed treason and revolted. At least Sharif Hussein and some of his followers did, not all the Arabs did. But, I have to be careful here about my nomenclature and vocabulary. But the British government, for a whole variety of reasons, and I don't have 2 hours to explain it, chose after the war, particularly Lloyd George's government, set the scene to continue with the promise to the Zionist organisation and the mandate and so on, the implementation of the Balfour Declaration. So, what is important in a book like this as well is where do you find the truth? Because if you talk to historians, and I've talked to quite a few over the decades who've dealt with this, there are only 3 books in particular on the Hussein Ma'man. One is Eli Khaduri's book of 1976 in the Anglo-Arab print. You've got Isaiah Friedman a bit later, a bit earlier and a bit later, who was at university in Israel. And you've got Abdul Latif Tibawi, who wrote another book on it. So where is the truth on all of this? So I had these books in my hand, I read them very thoroughly, and when I went into the archives, I found myself reading the sources, I found myself reading the actual original documents from the 1920s, and I looked at Abdul Latif Tibawi's interpretation of these same sources, where he quoted them. I looked at what Eli Khaduri said of these same sources, and I looked at Isaiah Friedman what he said in the same sources. And I could see, eventually, that Isaiah Friedman in particular, not only misinterpreted sources, but he actually misrepresented sources. And when I read it to start with, there were just one or two sources that I realised there's something fundamentally wrong here. There's something fundamentally untruthful here. But I put it down to, well, maybe a mistake, maybe he had an off day, he didn't have his cup of coffee, or whatever. But when you go through 20 or 30 more sources and 20 or 30 more quotes in his book from the same source, and they are the same source, it's in his footnotes, it's exactly the same source, and you see that the source has been misrepresented, not just misinterpreted, then you realise this man had an ideology. Okay, so there's a lot more to it than that, but that's basically where it comes from in terms of how do you discern who has an ideology. Kaduri in the Anglo-Arab Labyrinth 1976 was much more subtle about it. He was also very Zionist, but he was more subtle about it. But they both basically said Palestine was not promised. Abdul Latif Tibawi was very clear it was. I'm very clear it was. Ari Schleim is very clear it was. Ilan Pape is very clear it was. Rashid Khalid is very clear it was. And the Arabic is absolutely clear. And I try and describe it in my book, and I basically run a coach in horses through, in one of my chapters, through Kaduri's work and through Isaiah Friedman's work. Last thing, the bigger picture, Sir Martin Gilbert, the late Sir Martin Gilbert, who was a figure of the establishment here, had a house in Jerusalem and so on, wrote about 70 or 80 books, and was Churchill's official biographer. And he used to go to Israel every year and give a valedictory lecture and so on. And in 2011, and it's on YouTube, in 2011 he was speaking to an exclusively Jewish audience down at Ben Gurion University about the beginning of the mandate. And I listened to this on YouTube, and it was really interesting. And right in the middle of it, this is Sir Martin Gilbert, right in the middle of it, his mask slipped, I would say, and he morphed, he lapsed into integrity, I would say, basically, in terms of his lack of partiality. And this is what he said, and I quote, and this to me is the key, this is the key sentence to understanding British mandatory policy during the mandate, the whole of the mandate, okay, from 1922 to 1948, in terms of land sales, in terms of immigration policy, everything, okay? This is the quote. He said, "The centerpiece of British mandatory policy was the withholding of representative institutions in Palestine for as long as there was an Arab majority." Okay? That's the fundamental sentence that everybody, in a sense, is the foundation stone for understanding all the parliamentary blather, understanding what Churchill and Balfour and all the others were saying publicly. I better stop there.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was absolutely riveting. You all saw it. Okay, now I'm turning my back on you lot. So, Professor Tahrir, we have, like last year, we have some Hassan Kanafani politics. Do you mind holding it up for me? Thank you so much. So I feel for PBA, Kanafani is always with us, and this book is incredibly welcome. Last year, some of you may remember, we had a much smaller book, The Revolution from 1936 to 39. which was translated, in fact, by somebody you'll hear from shortly. Well, first of all, I just want you, before I really ask a question, I want to know what Kanafani means to you personally. Oh, sorry.
Thank you for such an easy question, Victoria.
Oh, I've got several others. They're all easy.
Okay, what does Kanafani mean personally to me? My name is Tahrir. Tahrir means liberation. My father was one of the founders of the Arab nationalist movement in the early 50s. And he knew and met and was friends with George Habash and Wadi Haddad and Kanafani. He ate ice cream with Kanafani as well, that's what he told me. So I grew up in a house that talked only about resistance and what resistance is, what it means, all kinds of resistance, armed resistance, cultural resistance. My family was personally involved in both kinds of resistance. Can I say that? Okay, so what does Kanafani mean to me? For me, I delved into his literature. I loved his literature. I loved what it meant. It made so much sense to me, to the kind of background that I grew up in, my father especially. And even, it impacted us to the point that, my literature or my study of literature later on in life became just resistance literature. My brother, who is now passed away, was a biochemist, but studied the olive tree, the resistant olive tree, and the resistant compound in the leaf of the olive tree that made the leaves of the olive tree not wither due to the bitter component of the olive tree. So it all goes back to resistance, really. So that's, it became a very much part of our life. And the son, the way I like to call him, like a friend of mine, became very much a part of my life as well. So that's on the personal level, Victoria. Yes, now.
So I'd also like you to talk a bit about the production of this book. It's extremely rare to have a book that is such a collective work. So many different writers, translators, checkers, back and forth. It's a really wonderful example of that kind of work, and very rare. So if you could talk a bit about that.
First of all, why this book? Because Ghassan Kanafani basically to the world is known only as a literary writer, a novelist, a short story writer. But Ghassan was so much bigger than that. He was also a political strategist. He was a political theorist. He was an intellectual. He was the intellectual of the Palestinian Revolution. Ghassan became a member of the ANM and wrote for the ANM, the Arab Nationalist Movement. Then he became a member of the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and became the philosopher of that organization as well. So why did we feel that we needed a book like this? Is because we needed to introduce the world to Ghassan Kanafani, not only the novelist, but the thinker, the theorist, the intellectual. He is not only a France phenom, he's more than that. He's Amilcar Cabral, Aimé Césaire, and every poet, and he was an artist as well, that you can think of, all, that came together in one person. So we needed to introduce the world to a Ghassan, the side of Ghassan that they did not know. Now 25 people worked on this book, translators, and people who wrote introductions to each chapter, commenting on the different essays, political essays, interviews. It's divided up into themes. So we needed to place Ghassan in his rightful place. He's not to belittle in any way novelists and artists. He was that, and that's enough for so many people. People like Mahmoud Darwish was a great poet, right? But Ghassan is multi-talented. And we need to put Ghassan right up there with the great thinkers of revolution, of anti-colonial struggle, of decolonial studies. He needs to become one of the major names in decolonial studies. We talked to a lot of people, a lot of translators, and so many people were excited. A lot of big names are here as well in this book. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit, Victoria, about, I'm going to call it the interconnectedness of things, the way that Ghassan thought of things. For example, armed struggle and cultural resistance. For Ghassan Kanafani, any successful armed struggle, for armed struggle to be successful, it needed to be grounded in cultural resistance, because cultural resistance is what builds awareness. It is what creates the new man, the new woman. It is a revolutionary becoming. It is a process. So if you just have armed resistance without having a strong basis, foundation in cultural resistance, you would simply have an empty shell. Armed resistance wouldn't mean anything. So the interconnectedness of the two is very important, and this is clear in the book. Also, the interconnectedness of Zionist settler colonialism, and this is something that Ghassan made us see and what we can see happening in the world today, and that is Zionist settler colonialism is connected to Western imperialism and hegemony, which is also connected to Arab reaction, that is reactionary regimes, reactionaryism, if I can make it an ism, okay? So the connections, it's a network of things. And at the same time, we have the interconnectedness between the Palestinian struggle, liberation movement, and other liberation movements around the world, in the Arab world and beyond, not only in the global south, but also in the global north. The peoples of the global north are enslaved to a very greedy capitalism that can only perpetrate genocide upon other populations. And I mean, we call it, it is called, quote, not euphemistic, but they call it the free world. But this free world is not free in any way. The peoples of this world are just as enslaved as the peoples of any other world. So the connection between the freedom of Palestine, the freedom of the Arab world, and the freedom of the global south, and peoples also in the global north. Interconnectedness, then, I say, is very important. One last thing that I want to talk about is the importance of all the important terminologies and words that Ghassan coined. He created words like resistance literature, adab al-muqawamah, the combatant writer, al-adib al-muqatil. The writer is a fighter, a fighting people, okay? He talked about in his interviews For example, about you all, I'm sure you all heard this interview with the Australian journalist Richard Carlton, the conversation between the neck and the sword. So when the Australian journalist asked him, why don't you just talk? He's like, talk to whom? Talk to the Israelis. Talk about what? Talk about the possibility of not killing whom? So Hassan was very aware of the use of words and language. That is very important to Hassan Kanafani, and it's part of our book. Also, I just want to mention Gaza for Hassan was a very important place in terms of it being the heart of resistance. And he says it, we have it on page 188 in the book. He says, I have it memorized. He says, the people of Gaza are tougher. They're made of steel. Why? Because Hassan knew that to suffer, to be besieged, to be always under siege, doesn't make you surrender, it makes you stronger. It makes you resist. And resistance can never die. They can try as they're doing right now in Gaza, but resistance will never die. And for example, he says it even in his literature, in his letter to Gaza. Letter to Gaza by Hassan Kanafani, by the way, was written 70 years, to be exact, to be honest, 69 years ago. And it was about how the Israelis bombarded Gaza and how Nadia, the little girl who threw herself upon her brothers and sisters to save them, had her leg amputated from the top of the thigh. And in this story, the narrator tells his friend Mustafa, who was in California studying at a university, he says to him, Mustafa, come back to learn from Nadia's leg, amputated from the top of the thigh, what life is and what existence is worth. And I think we can see what is happening now in Gaza. We need to learn from the people of Gaza what life is and what existence is worth. Shall I go on?
Thank you so much. We're on number 6. This is the afterlife of Palestinian images. Thank you. So, Azza El Hassan is the author.
El Hassan.
El Hassan. Oh, sorry, I was reading the wrong person. El Hassan. What drew you into this search for lost and broken images, and what ideas did you have about how they could come today into the way Palestinian artists and filmmakers like you can work? Can you talk about that?
Hi. Well, I suppose the best way is to tell you about the book.
Please.
That's a good question. So this book really is about what do you do? What do you do after violence have started and ended? What do you do with what remains, your objects that stay? What survives the violence, not what gets lost? So it's about photos and films that survive the violence. It's a common sight to see people after a bombing looking through the rubbles, usually for a picture that has survived, or their phone where they have some images. Now, for years, Israel has destroyed Palestinian archives, and it has crossed borders to destroy Palestinian archives. And the ones the events we know about and that get recorded is when it's institutional archives. Like the Palestine Film Institute archives, we know that the Israelis looted it, like the Palestine Research Center, blah, blah, blah. But what doesn't get recorded is personal archives. And actually in 2003, I lost my own personal archive because during a random search, Israeli search of Palestinian houses in Ramallah, the army went into my flat. I was living with my flatmate, I wasn't in the house, and I had lots of tapes, films, which lashes material I've collected, and I was planning to make films out of them. And they stepped on them, they broke them. At that time, it wasn't digital yet. So, and this really angered me. Like before that, I used to think there was some kind of a luxury of not having complete archives because you can imagine what was there instead of having something so factual. But suddenly, losing my own archives set me on a journey that lasted till today and took me to work on the afterlife of Palestinian images. Now, the afterlife of these images is not the end of their life. The afterlife is, in a way, a new life these objects gain when they survive the violence. And usually they survive it because there's a person, a salvager, who comes in and decides to interfere in this violent setting and to save this object. So many times you find someone who went and took a film, and usually when there's a bombing, not only the objects get destroyed, but also people are forced to move. So they take with them these objects. And I remember many times during invasions, we would pack bags and we would put our passport in it, our pyjama, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes, many times, albums, photo albums. So people carry these objects with them. Now, when I started working on this project, I put a sentence on Facebook. Can anyone tell me of a photo or a film which they have and which they took after a violent event? And I was so surprised with the response. Now, this, of course, I didn't go and check if they were all survivors. But the fact that so many people thought that what they have is an object that has survived violence was in itself so interesting. So in this book, I trace and I find photos and films that have survived. But I am not a person who is obsessed with the past. I actually love the present. So my search is to find this material and find a new use for them, to use them again and connect with them again. And there's lots of talk about archive of disappearance, that the Israelis are erasing us, and when we search and find these objects, we are using these objects to say we once existed and this no longer is present. And I wanted the opposite of archive of disappearance. I wanted an archive of presence and of continuation, because I think as long as you can continue to create narratives, then you stay alive. So through this book, I engaged, interestingly enough, in P21. So lots of these images were brought to this space, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there's a huge gallery down below. And I began working with them, rearranging them, editing them, and through that I discovered new experiences. One of the experiments in this work was to bring camera of a famous Palestinian cinematographer called Hani Johariya, who was killed in Lebanon during the 70s. And his camera, which was with him, was completely destroyed, but it survived. And his family have kept his camera for years with them. So I brought the camera here and I asked his daughter to reassemble it in a box so people can come and see it. Now, as she was doing this, she started smelling The smell of powder, of course there was no smell of powder, but Hiba, his daughter, was convinced that she could smell it because rearranging the material triggered all of this. So all of these experiments also, one of the nice things is one of the people here who came to see the exhibition said to me, suddenly I can see all my family, and I didn't know it was his family that was there, remember? So that's it. So it's about a series of engagements to find a new use for these images. And in most of the times, in fact in all of them, I do find a new possibility, a new way to use this material. But it's never the same use which it was originally intended for. So the process does lead me to discover that the violence did change us, and it did change our objects. We are no longer the same people, nor are our images the same as when they were originally created. But it doesn't mean that they are no longer usable. And in a way, it doesn't mean that we are no longer usable. I'm gonna end by telling you a little story that triggered all of this search. So I did a film a long time ago where I go on a journey of search from Palestine to Jordan to Syria to Lebanon and search for the lost Palestine Film Institute archive. Now on this journey, I actually do not find the archive. And as I move, I create my own archive in this film. But in Syria, I meet a cameraman who have salvaged from the Institute during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, a camera, and inside it there was a 16mm film. So I get very excited because that's the whole film. I'm looking for this material, and then suddenly I find this guy who does have this material. So I take the film of him and I try to develop it, and I find nothing on it. But just by developing it, I start imagining what is possible, and I come up with a new narrative, and this is what this book is about.
I just want to add that the chapter that she's talking about has the wonderful title, Plundering the Future.
Yeah.
We may come back to that if we have more time, but anyway, thank you for your lovely book. Now, I don't know what we've got behind us. No. The next book is number 7. No One Knows Their Blood Type. Do you mind? It's by Maya Abu Al-Hayat, and she's not with us, but the translator is Hazem Jamjoum, who many of you will have seen last year, when he was also the translator of a Kanafani book. So I like the Kanafani continuation that we're having. I just want to start by asking you, I think she's a magic woman. If she was only here, she's very young, and I know she would be electric. But I just want to ask you, I know you haven't met her, hoping to meet her here. What made you want to translate the book?
I was, this book was gifted to my housemate in New York, in Brooklyn, and I kind of pilfered it and read it, and fell in love with it right away, because it does a few things that I hadn't really seen done in Palestinian literature. It had taken that story of the resistance fighter, where, which is kind of something we are all raised to want to be, right? In some kind, somebody who's involved in the liberation of our country, but turns it in, but kind of looks at it from the domestic space. Who is this person in relation to their wife? Who is this person in relation to their daughter? Who is this person in relation to their friends and the rest of their family? And what does kind of this socializing someone into becoming a weapon, what does that turn them into, right? And so it's kind of like, we have the Che Guevara poster up on our wall, but then what is Che Guevara like as a father or a brother or an uncle or whatnot? That was one thing I really loved about this book. The other thing I really loved about this, and by the way, the answer is not rosy.
Yeah, it's not rosy.
And it's also not a full frontal attack on that either, right? It brings out just the complexity of what that is. And there's something about Maya which is really special, which is that she insists on being someone who's reminding us that none of this is normal. The fact that we have a child carrying a stone in the face of the tank, yes, that's heroism, yes, that's courage, yes, that's valor, but it's not normal. That we should never forget that this child needs to be able to be a child. The reason we fight to be free is so that this child can be a child. And you know, we can give hundreds of examples of the not normal that we need to be reminded of, because oftentimes we kind of get into this rah-rah, bravado place, which we need. It keeps our morale up, it reminds us what we're fighting for, these kinds of things. But sometimes we start to normalize the horrific. The other part of this book that I really, really love, which I think, and there's echoes, I think, in Sarah's book and elsewhere, which is oftentimes telling the story of Palestine really focuses on the direct military occupation. So you'll find diaspora film directors, writers and filmmakers from 48 occupied Palestine, etc., coming to a kind of produce culture and immediately going to the the place that's under direct military occupation and the confrontation with the soldier, the checkpoint, the aerial bombardment, that kind of very direct, overt military occupation violence. But what we don't have enough of, I think, is stories that emerge from the different kinds of diaspora and exile, our dispersion, our shatat, stories of kind of 48 Palestine, but most importantly, stories that bridge across multiple kind of Palestinian subjectivities. So I don't think we have the novel that tells us about those thousands of Palestinians who Indira Gandhi gave scholarships to go and study in India in the 70s. We don't even know that that happened. The tens of thousands, if not more, of the Palestinians who had some affiliation to a political faction that got them a scholarship to the Soviet bloc, and what that looked like, and what that meant when they came back or didn't. And all the other stories, those Palestinians who ended up in the Gulf. We have Hassan Kanafani gave us Men in the Sun, but where's the rest of those stories? Where's the stories of those Palestinian workers in the oil fields who tried to get organized and set up labor unions, and then the Saudi regime came in and smashed their heads in? We don't even know that happened. That's not even part of the Palestinian narrative, but it is part of the Palestinian narrative. And so one thing that I really love about this particular book is that it actually takes us through Amman and Tunis and Beirut and post-Oslo Palestine, which is just a sliver. Like, this is, even though it's doing this, it's still just a sliver, but at least it's opening the door and saying, look, this is also a Palestinian story. This is also part of our story that is legitimate to tell. Not every Palestinian story needs to be Avi with his machine gun barging into the house and saying you have 15 minutes to leave before I destroy it, right?
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you more about the female characters, the young women. I've never seen almost anywhere a novel of young women in a very precarious position, but with such vivacity. They actually make it funny what they're living through. And I wondered if you had that same response as I did to these girls.
It's funny. I mean, obviously this is the thing that makes you fall in love with the book, right? I mean, I answered first in that kind of like brainier way, but that immediate emotional connection to the book is these young women.
Yeah.
And even the last chapter with the not young at all women, but hilarious. And her dry wit, like Maya writes them. But the thing is also, these are the women I grew up with These are my cousins. I know this humor. You know, this is the humor of home. This is the humor on this panel. And this is, so, you know, it's not stark for me. It's just, it's familiar in the sense of the intimacy of at home, the kind of young women full of life and fire and power and humor, and the ability to even weaponize that humor and that wit and that sarcasm and that dryness and that even kind of like darkness in moments. For those of you who haven't read the book actually kind of moves through the members of its first person perspectives of the different characters in this 4-person family at different stages of, and in kind of different moments between the early 1980s and 2013. So different characters at different ages in different places. And you know, it's not too much, it's like 5 chapters. So it's not like it's
a short book.
Constantly roaming narrator. But there's one exception, which is the father in the family. His chapter is written in the 3rd person. So Maya refuses to let him have his own voice. She keeps it for herself. But then everybody else sort of like is speaking from themselves, and between their interior thoughts and what kind of dialogue is showing up on the page, it's very heavy subject matter.
Yeah.
You know, everything from an Israeli invasion and massacre to occupation and roadblocks and checkpoints to domestic violence and violence against children. And so, and yet and she doesn't kind of make you laugh in a moment where this violence is showing up. It's not that. But you can see how humor and darkness and wit are also kind of weapons and coping mechanisms and survival mechanisms. And for people who come from communities of struggle, I think it's immensely familiar.
Yeah.
Right? It's immensely familiar that you don't allow yourself to wallow, because that's a defeat. You flip it on its head and you demand it's not a right. You demand that even in that worst moment, I'm gonna smile.
Yeah,
And that's how I overcome this. That's how I keep being me in this moment.
Thank you so much. Okay, now we're at number 8, which is the collected writings and text messages of Rifat Alaria, who we all know. And I just want to say that we have 2 of his students with us tonight. Can you just put your hands up, girls? Apparently there are 5. Oh, there's another one there. Oh, are you Ahmed? We looked for you earlier. Oh, okay, great. Well, the first 2 were Amna and Reem. Anyway, you're very, very welcome, and it really enhances our evening to be with you. I'm going to have, and can you open it a bit so that people can see how it's incredibly beautifully produced? Anyway, it's Yousef Aljamal who is going to talk about it, because he's the convener. He was also a student of Rifat's. And I wanted to ask you to start with, can you take yourself back and tell us a bit about before, how it was being his student, and how was that intellectual life?
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here today. There are a lot of stories to share about Rifat, and if you want to learn these stories, you have to talk to his students. So Rifat returned back to Gaza in 2007 after finishing his master in comparative literature from UCL. He was 26 at the time, and I took a course with him titled Introduction to English Literature. In the introduction, we learned about English literature and much more, so it wasn't just an introduction because Rifat had a vast knowledge. It was a sea of knowledge, an ocean of knowledge on literature, English literature, but also literature written in English and Palestinian literature. And initially I thought that Rifat was one of these students in the class because he was too young. And at the time I didn't know anything about Rifat. Zero knowledge. I just took this class because it was mandatory. And then I learned everything about Rifat. I almost failed his first course. He was very tough. Many students thought that he was brutal with grades. But there are also many students who appreciated his style of teaching. And there's a fun fact about Rifat that the number of students who got A's in his courses was always higher than the number of students who failed his courses. But it's always the bad students, so those students who fail courses with Rifat, that would go to the department and say, this is a horrible teacher, you have to fire him. So Rifat would always encourage students who feel good about the course to go and give some positive feedback to the department so that he could defend himself in front of the department against these bad students. I took another course with him titled Translation 2, and there's another fact about Rifat that initially he wanted to do a master in translation. He loved translation, and then he changed his mind last minute. He finally decided that literature is his field that he liked the most. So just to give you an idea about how, like if you take a course with Rifat, you're dead for the rest of the semester. You will not have time to go out or see your friends or go on, any sort of vacation, because he will give you a huge amount of homework, and not just a huge amount of homework, a huge amount of work that if you do, you will get grades, extra grades with Rifat. So just to give you an idea, one time he said, if students find 1,000 words from Longman Dictionary that we do not use in day-to-day conversations and write 2,000 sentences so that readers who read these sentences and these words for the first time understand the meaning from the context and translate them into Arabic. So you end up with 4,000 sentences. You will get 5 grades. Or you will get a grade if you read I saw Ramallah. I was born here, I was born there. Nothing to lose but my life. All these, memoirs and novels written by Palestinians in the diaspora. The Time of White Horses by Ibrahim Nasrallah. Mornings in Jenin, etc. So that was the reputation about Rifat. Either he's the best teacher or he's the worst teacher, no middle ground. There were also running jokes in the department about Rifat that he kept a copy of Hamlet under his pillow when he slept. So there's also a fun fact about Rifat that he loved Shakespeare so much. And he taught Shakespeare for many years in Gaza. And I remember in 2014 when Rifat, Rawan and I toured the United States to promote his first edited book, Gaza Writes Back. We went to the Shakespeare Museum in Washington, D.C., and Rifat placed the Palestinian kufiya around Shakespeare and took a picture. And he would always repeat the joke that Shakespeare was in fact an Arab sheikh called Shakespeare, which was repeated by the late Libyan president Mohammad El Akkad. So you have this fun teacher, you learn a lot. If you're around Rifat, definitely you learn a lot. but you suffer a lot. You laugh a lot. So Rifat had the greatest sense of dark humor. And again, his students in the audience can also relate to this dark humor that he always had. Like, just to quote him, he always repeated, "My only problem with the humanity is people." And then he would also encourage his students to create memes about his teaching style. So there was, in fact, a whole page on Facebook or Facebook group that was dedicated to creating memes about Rifat by his students, and he was on that group. I also know that Rifat created the first English, probably the first, most likely the first English website out of Gaza, called iopad.net, Eye on Palestine. And he had the handle Big Brother. He would encourage his students to join the platform and write and discuss and engage in conversations and improve their English. As I said, he had the handle Big Brother, so one of his students joined and he chose the handle Biggest Brother to tease him, but he laughed about it. And he dedicated his entire life to teaching students on creative writing. He offered these courses for free. I helped him organize dozens of these courses. He was also invested, so he wanted to create an army of young writers out of Gaza, and I think he was successful in doing that. He taught English at different levels in different places for about 24 years. Including in USAID-funded programs where he taught Malcolm X. And he wrote his PhD thesis on John Donne as a revolutionary poet. So he was engaged in revolution. He organized a talk one time in Gaza, I remember, titled, "Make Some Noise, Malcolm X in Gaza." So he wanted us to watch the documentary about the life of Malcolm X. He gifted the autobiography of Malcolm X to many of his students. And I know that he helped many of his students financially. So there's something about Rifat that he would buy dozens of copies of certain courses, and he would donate them to the students, and he wouldn't even tell the students that he donated them. He would say the department has extra copies. And during the genocide, he also helped some of his students financially. He found them on the road, he gave them money. And when he would go to a bakery, for example, to line up to get bread, some of his students would offer him their place, but he would refuse. Say, "This is your labor, you've been waiting here for hours, I will wait just like you do." He would walk every day during the genocide for about 25,000 steps just to get access to the internet, to write out of Gaza and to debunk Zionist lies about Gaza, the genocide, and what's happening in Palestine. In 2013, I was lucky enough to travel with him to Malaysia because he started his PhD. So he won a Fulbright scholarship. And I remember his IELTS grade was the highest in the Gaza Strip. But again, Israel denied him a permit to leave Gaza to use the scholarship. So he lost the scholarship, but he did not give up. He applied for PhD in Malaysia, and he went to UPM, University Putra, Malaysia, and he did his PhD on John Donne, as I said, and then he returned back to Gaza. I was lucky enough, it was out of sheer luck, that I was with Rifat on the same flight that day. From Rafah to Cairo, and then Cairo to Kuala Lumpur. And I remember Rifat on the way to Cairo, so Palestinians were not allowed to travel directly. We had to cross from Gaza through Egypt, and then we're deported. We go to Cairo airport, and then we get tickets and we travel wherever we want to travel to. So Rifat was on the same bus next to me, and he took my iPad. I had an iPad, and I for some time I didn't have a smartphone, so I would always spend my time on my iPad. So Rifat called me iPad man. So he took my iPad and he was playing games. His laptop was open in front of him. He was editing a text, writing an email, tweeting. Like, he would always do 10 things at the same time, and that's why he achieved a lot, although he lived for a short period of time. He was killed at the age of 44. So he was playing also some games on my iPad at the same time, and doing all these things, and watching YouTube, and doing all these things, writing a recommendation letter to one of his students. And as we approached Kuala Lumpur, he asked me if I had accommodation. And I said no, because I tried to travel 5 times. I would return back to Gaza. Travel out of Gaza was always difficult, including for Rifat, or especially for Rifat. And any Gazan for this matter. I said no. He immediately took me in. He said, you can stay with me in my living room until you find accommodation. So I stayed with him for 3 weeks on his sofa. His flatmate, Mohammed Hassouna, was also killed during the genocide. And Rifat was busy because he was working, doing online work, also doing his PhD. We would meet most of the time at night when he's back from school. I am back from school, we would talk. And Rifat was very generous with me. He offered me money because I didn't have enough money at the time. And he said, you can give it back when you have enough money. So what happened, I left Rifat's apartment, and a friend of mine from the Punjab invited me for dinner. It was very delicious. I posted on social media that now I can say I had dinner. And Rifat saw that and he went mad and he called me and said, you are ungrateful. I have been feeding you for 3 weeks. You didn't say thank you. You have to come and apologize. I said, no, I didn't mean to insult you. You were very generous and nice. I just like the food. So you have to come now and apologize. Otherwise, I will burn you alive. This is the kind of, dark humor he had. I said, no, I'm not. I'm too young to be burned. So I said, okay, I will come and apologize. And then when I went to his apartment, I found that he drew a cross in the middle of his apartment. I said, I was going to burn you here. And then he said, the only way I can forgive you is if you go downstairs and buy me a watermelon. So I went downstairs and I bought him a watermelon and we shared it. And he said, okay, now I forgive you. There are lots of stories. I remember traveling with him throughout Malaysia, but also to the United States to promote Gaza Rights Back. His first edited book, he told me that when I edited this book and it was published, it felt like having a baby for the first time. And he loved Gaza Rights Back. I contributed a story to Gaza Rights Back. It's the only short story that I wrote in my life. That's because Rifat pulled me to write it. But there's a fun fact also about Gaza Rights Back. There are 15 authors, 12 of them were women. So Rifat always encouraged his female students to write. He would encourage them to go abroad and seek better education and come back. He would always remind his students that they needed to come back. His genocide companion, Azza El was in Malaysia, and he was suggesting to Rifat that, I want to stay in Malaysia, do something, do this and that. But Rifat would tell him, but you can do this in Gaza. So he always wanted people to come back to Gaza. And he was very proud of his town, Shuja'iyya. Ahmed is from Shuja'iyya. Ghassan Kanafani lived in Shuja'iyya. And I remember when we went to the United States with Jihad on the Brooklyn bridge, it's a wooden bridge, he engraved the name of his town, Shuja'iyya, on the bridge. And he wrote, Shuja'iyya, DC. And he knew all these jokes about, cities, for example. He would joke about the New York pizza or the deep dish pizza with like the competition between Chicago and New York. And a final story, we stayed with a guy called James in Bellingham, a town in Washington State. And Rifat forgot his computer mouse at James' place. So James wrote to him and he said, I can send it to you in the mail. But Rifat thought that, it would cost him more money if he did. than if Rifat bought a new one. So he said, okay, no, don't worry about it. But he never forgot that, because he's the guy, like, when it comes to making a story out of nothing. That's why he was the natural storyteller. So 10 years later, on October 7, 2023, I was there. So I told Rifat, I am in Bellingham. He said, go to James and ask him if he has 1,000 mice. So I went to James and I asked him, I said, why would I have 1,000 mice in my house? I said, Rifat is asking because he left his computer mouse at your place 10 years ago. He said, no, I don't have 1,000 mice. And then, so I went back to Rifat and I told him he doesn't have 1,000 mice. And Rifat said, that's probably because he has a cat. So he loved pun. He played a game called Pun Intended. And he described his teaching style as tough love. So I think that's why he wanted every one of his students to be the best or to become the best version of themselves. And he did that by being too tough. But again, that's also a form of love. And that's why we love Rifat, and we will continue to love Rifat and honor him the same way he honored us when he was alive, but also even after he was murdered. That's like the honor of my life, to say that I was a student of Rifat, and I think every student of Rifat would share the same thing.
Thank you so much. I think we could have had another whole evening, and I'm sure at the end we will be kicked out, but we've got one more author to talk to, and then I know there will be lots of people who want to ask questions. So, this is Omar El Akkad, whose book you probably know. I love the way that the publisher has produced it, so you can read it. One day everyone will always have been against this. But the full title, which some of you may know, is One Day, When It's Safe, When There's No Personal Downside to Calling a Thing What It Is, When It's Too Late to Hold Anyone Accountable, Everyone Will Always Have Been Against This. Completely brilliant title. Do you mind holding a book up? Oh, maybe. Well, this is not an easy book to talk about in a short way, and I'm going to try my best. Omar, you've been a very successful journalist for the hated Western press for quite a long time. But then he wrote two absolutely brilliant novels, and I do hope they're for sale outside. First one is American War, and the second one is What Strange Paradise. Anyway, I strongly recommend them, but we're not talking about them. I think this book is a completely different genre from anything you've done before. And in a way, the way you've written about memory is very central to the book. And there are some memories in that, like the two of your father being humiliated by first Egyptian powers and then the United States, and your own experiences of what you saw in Afghanistan and Iraq and Guantanamo Bay in terms of American powers' capacity for pretending that what's happening is not happening. And for a journalist, this is obviously incredibly challenging, and so that's why you moved into fiction. And sorry, I should have. You're just going with the flow. Thank you so much. So I want to ask you, what it was like for you when you were writing this book, which is full of so much pain, and you've managed to make it all visible in the way that it's supposed to be visible.
Thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it. I can't imagine how much work goes into moderating a panel with this many people on it. It's a privilege to be here with you and with all of you. And probably the greatest privilege of my career to be mentioned alongside these incredible writers and thinkers. With respect to this book, it's overwhelmingly in my mind a book about the West. It's a book about a chasm that is inherent to a certain kind of mainstream liberalism, and it's the chasm between the performance of virtue and the grotesque reality. Every day for a year and a half under a Democratic administration where I live in the United States, I would watch spokespeople for the most powerful government on earth talk to me about their desire for a lasting peace and their concern for the well-being of Palestinians and a whole host of other subjects that, not to be crass, but is complete and utter horseshit, while at the same time knowing that the same administration is using my tax money to tear kids in half. And there comes a point where someone, even as spineless as myself, can no longer look away from that chasm. And I think a lot of the book is about what happens once you can't look away from that. Not just relative to me, but relative to a lot of people where I live, who have reached a point where the obvious logical endpoint of a system of endless taking, endless theft, endless violence has produced the conditions where one must shed the privilege of obliviousness, because you can't be oblivious to the damage this is doing to your soul. A lot of the examples in the book come from various points in my life where I have seen this manifest in various ways, not just political ways, but rhetorical ways, linguistic ways. There's a section in the book where I talk about this moment where I was covering the prison camps in Guantanamo, and we're getting a tour of this, and the soldier giving us a tour, I was asking him a question. I said, so when do the prisoners, and he stopped me and he said, we don't have prisoners here, sir, we have detainees. It was very important to the conception of the place and to this person's conception of themselves that there be no prisoners, that there only be detainees, because a prisoner implies a prison sentence. Detainee you can hold forever. And a lot of the book is just about trying to sort of interrogate these systems of violence without which the physical layer of violence could not exist. The bombs and the bullets, which I've seen in my career, could not exist without linguistic violence, euphemistic violence, the violence of censorship, the violence of obliviousness. It's a book that has gotten a lot more traction than it deserves, and I think there's two reasons for that. The first is the vacuum into which it entered. A book like this by a major publisher is a rare thing. There's far, far better books, including, of course, the ones on this list. But it came out in a moment where there was such an immense kind of institutional repression that I think it acted as a sort of steam vent for a lot of people. I would do all of these events. I've been on the road for most of this year, and at virtually every event in the United States, in most of the Western world where I would travel, somebody would come up to me afterwards and say, this is the first space where I could just sit with this, right? And it's not because they like the book or they have any affinity for me, none of that. It's because, they would say, well, I can't talk about this at work because I might lose my job. I can't talk about this with my friends because they might stop being my friends. There was this immense component of knowing that you are seeing the worst thing imaginable every day. Every day. It's live streamed, it's instantaneous, it's intimate. And you're doing it, right? My tax dollars are killing these folks. I'm doing that. and yet not being able to, in any kind of institutional sense, even address this, let alone stand up against. That's part of it. I think another part of it is that there's a measure of reflection that certainly in the part of the world where I live has been very difficult but becoming more and more necessary, which is this notion that you cannot look at what is being done to Palestinians in the most grotesque, immediate way right now, but has been going on for decades, and not see a reflection of the society you live in. Because the systems of endless taking are the same. And that has I think, created the conditions whereby someone who otherwise might have exercised those muscles of obliviousness is no longer able to. But with respect to what you said about pain, I mean, obviously I couldn't write this book without addressing my own complicity, and that necessitates a measure of writing about yourself and so on and so forth, but I can't in good conscience use the word pain. What the hell have I suffered? I've suffered nothing. I live on the launching side of the missiles. I can sit here and tell you that I'm this committed pacifist. By virtue of how my tax money is spent, I'm one of the most violent human beings on earth. There is a deeply selfish component to a lot of what's in this book. And one part of that is to be able to say that at the very least I said something. From this perch in the heart of the most violent and protected nation in the history of the world, where I happen to have, by virtue of complete luck, the ability to live, I at least stood up during the middle of what is the most grotesque, evil thing I have seen in my lifetime and said something. That is the bare minimum. And I struggle to use the word pain in relation to any of the construction of this book, because I've seen variants of pain over the last 2 years that have completely rearranged my relationship with that word.
I'm being told that we have to stop, but we can go to Q&A, or we cannot.
I think so.
We can.
We have until 9:15.
Okay. Well,
Sorry.
I would have liked to have gone on for another evening, but I think just to be honourable to all the other writers. There are 4. Can you hold that for a sec? Where are the? Thank you so much. Oh, you read my mind. Have we got the video of Pankaj? Okay, so we've got 4 books that the authors were not able to be here for reasons some often to do with visas, and one of them has sent a 1.5-minute video. Do you need me to move away? Or is it going to come up? Oh. Yes. Volume?
In Palestine, just, the world after Gaza is unlike any book that I've written, in the sense that it was written really out of a very strong sense of compulsion. I felt compelled to write it. I was one of those millions and millions, if not billions of people driven mad by the continuous exposure to atrocity, to extreme atrocity in Palestine. And not just, scenes of violence committed by Israeli soldiers, and of course, the hate speech uttered by Israeli politicians and journalists, but also the grotesque spectacle of Western politicians and journalists enabling those war crimes, enabling them through military assistance, moral assistance, intellectual justifications. So I think, in that really horrific era, which is unfortunately not behind us, point, I felt that as a writer, I have a duty to at least try and fight some of the pernicious discourses on the subject, these sort of campaigns of propaganda that had turned so many people's heads over a very long period. And it was time to resurrect some neglected voices, some experiences and perspectives, and really offer a very different kind of history of the state of Israel, to really try and sort of, challenge the kind of moral blackmail that we've all been subjected to for decades. I'm really delighted to be included in this very distinguished shortlist. But I think whoever, no matter who wins, in many ways, all these books have contributed, I think, to a sharper, a clearer, a morally more liberating perspective on the greatest atrocity of our times. And for that, I am really grateful to all the other authors on this shortlist. Thank you.
Oh, good, you've still got the mic. So that was one. Dina's going to briefly speak about.
Yeah, I'm going to be really short. I was told
two sentences.
So this is the book, The Time Beneath the Concrete, by Nasser Abu Ahmed, which is a fascinating book because it's all, it's an archive of archives. Sorry? Yeah. So he talks about the question of Palestine through looking at the camp, the camp and the displacement, and looking at different archival material related to the camps. And for him, displacement is both the spatial and the temporal condition. So it's not only about the space, it's also about the time. Of the Palestinian question in general is that all Palestinians are encamped. They're encamped in one way or another. And I think that's a very important point to think about. Whether Palestinians are in Gaza or on the West Bank or in refugee camps or in the diaspora, we are all encamped. And I think I have to end here. Thanks.
Yes, you do. Thank you very much. The next one is this, called My Palestine, An Impossible Exile, by Mohammad Tarbush. It's the most lyrical description of life before 1948 ended the village that he lived in. And for that alone, I couldn't recommend it more strongly. But he then went on. As a child, he walked to Jordan because the aftermath of where he'd been left in Bethlehem was unbearable. He got himself an education. He ended up in the United States and became a very distinguished voice for Palestine. And the next one.
Yeah, so this is. Sorry, that didn't get applause. I feel like it deserves.
Oh, yes!
This is Perfect Victims in the Politics of Appeal, Mohammad Tarbush. Mohammed and I have never met, so I want to begin by apologizing to him in case I completely mangle with my interpretation of what he intended. For whatever it's worth, I think it's a masterwork. I think it's an absolutely exceptional piece of work. When it first came out, I picked up a copy immediately, and now I have about 6 copies because various people in my life would run up to me and be like, you need to read this. It is, besides being lyrical, besides obviously being written by a poet and somebody who has an immense command of language, it is one of the best pieces of writing I've ever read on the various privileges of asymmetric power and how they inevitably lead to the weakest possible argument. And watching those arguments demolished page by page is at once cathartic and maddening. This notion of what happens when you try to contend in good faith with a series of arguments that aren't even arguments, but if they were, are being done in obviously bad faith, and how that way lies madness. And then you start to read this book, you start to read these essays, and you get to a place where you see that taken apart. And it's like having an anvil lifted off your chest. It's an incredible piece of work. Over the last year and a half, I've gotten so many collections of exceptional writing from folks in Gaza, around Palestine, about just life, about what life looks like. And one of the overwhelming commonalities of these stories, and they're very different stories, is that when you live under this kind of brutality and this kind of occupation, there is a near daily infusion of humiliation and indignity, intentional imposition of indignity. And one of the most intentional and one of the most violent is the indignity of forcing you to contend with an obviously weak argument, an obviously stupid argument, where the weakness and the stupidity is not incidental, it's an expression of power. Look what I can get away with. And a lot of what this book is doing is tearing that apart, not only rhetorically against these arguments, but against the idea that you should be forced to contend with these arguments in the first place. It's incredibly, powerful. It's lyrical. It's also funny as hell at times, which is a difficult thing to do with this subject matter. And for that and many more reasons that I won't go into for time constraints, I think it's going to be remembered. I think it's going to be remembered as a foundational text for a very long time.
And finally, it really is finally, but there will be then time for a few questions. I've got a small message from our colleague, the Iraqi writer Haifa Zangana, who was a PBA judge for 10 years, but she can't be here tonight because she's not in Britain. She wanted me to hold this up to emphasize that tonight is the continuity of 14 years of these awards, and they celebrate forms of resistance in voicing the many, many textures of the Palestinian narrative. The book is a record of the winners and the keynote speeches that people have given, and the writers and historians such as Rashid Khalidi, Salman Abu Sitta, Salim Tamari, artists like the one you can see the cover of there is Kamal Boulata, and there's also pictures from Samia Halabi and two from Nabila Nani. Now, they've been here with us all this time, and we're all part of what they are. And in order to emphasize this continuity, that's why we at Memo produced this book, Writing Palestine. Thank you very much. And now, any questions, please raise your hand. We've got 10 minutes, I'm told, by the chief here. So please, can you stand up, the first person there? Is there another mic, or can we just manage? You can manage. Can you just give your name before you say?
Good evening, my name's Venus. Thank you very much for everyone coming in. Just speaking, it's been a really wholesome evening, so really thank you. Just for the Palestinian authors, I suppose, I came down from Leeds today, and I'm part of the Leeds Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And according to you, what do you think we could do on our weekly marches? Because we seem to be marching, but, and I'm sure I can speak for everyone here, it's like weekly, daily, I'm shouting into the abyss. And what more could we do? And I'm asking Palestinian authors in particular because I think it's important you're heard. To make ourselves heard or get bloody kissed on to listen.
Okay, I'm going to...
As much as the shekels won't allow me to.
I'm going to take 3 questions, and then various people are going to respond. There's first somebody here, and the lady in the blue hijab at the back.
Hello, my name is Hassan. I came from Gaza basically in the 5th month of this ongoing genocide. And I'm curious to ask you, Matthew, just because I'm also currently finishing my book, which is a collection of stories told during this genocide. I tried so hard to find the stories of life, love of the music. It's, simple stories that could reflect on how the people are being, coping day to day under these conditions. So I'm trying to stop myself from writing because currently I wrote about 90,000 words and I'm trying to stop by then. So I want like an advice of how to convince myself that I had enough stories, because you said something triggering to me. It's just tsunami of stories. I've worked in Gaza for the last 10 years as a journalist, so I understand the echo of these words. So I'm not sure how to stop. And with regards to the selection of these stories of your book, because it's also a struggle there. Sometimes I have to put the story on a scale of painful and appealing for the audience to read. Sometimes it's just too graphic because we have seen these images and videos. How did you select these stories in the first place? So it's a tough question, but it could help me to stop.
Okay, the lady, yes. Do you mind standing up? Be easier to hear. Sorry, can you speak more loudly?
My name is Konita. I am a journalist and author from South Africa. So obviously the South African experience and getting international solidarity was the writers were written about their stories in Mandela's book going out. What I wanted to ask from Omar, how do you kind of reignite hope into the world? There's this kind of overarching despair right now, and do you see a day where there's hope that's ignited in writing, and what does that look like?
Okay. Could
do you want to go first?
Yeah, but quick.
Very short. Thank you, Azza. Thank you for asking the question. Thank you for being here. I feel.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much for asking the question, and thank you for being here. I feel very unqualified to give advice. I'll try and be as concise and as practical as possible.
Or can you answer?
You have 90,000 words, you have a book. Do you have a publisher?
I better answer.
I'm currently in talks with publishers.
You're in talks with publishers?
But you've also shed the light on the fact that many of the publishers wouldn't be interested, and I've had it's a funny but it's also painful interaction with one of the publishers who said something about the book might not be getting enough sales, which I told them I don't care about sales.
Yeah. It's publishers come up with all sorts of things which are very, very disheartening. Don't be disheartened. You have 90,000 words, you have a book. What I would say is, how did we select these stories here? This was a process of collaboration, as with many of the books on the panel. There were different minds coming to play on which stories would work and which stories perhaps will be better suited to another medium, and I would urge you perhaps to think of that as well. That there are ways to tell stories, ways to use the stories and to platform the people who have contributed that won't necessarily fit between the covers of the book. And there are other ways to have those stories out into the world, digitally, visually, in audio terms. There are ways to encourage people, instead of writing, to be speaking. There are other methods in order to be able to tell the stories that you need to tell. I'm very, very happy, because I'm conscious of time, I'm very happy to have a chat with you afterwards as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Which of our Palestinians would like to respond? I think you can do the two questions in one. The one about hope and the one about what are we supposed to do more?
I can say it.
Who's up for it?
I can do some.
You?
I can't be the only one, but I have.
Well, make a stab at
And
it.
I'll be really fast. First, a resounding note of commiseration to both the question of hope and the question of protest. I didn't get very much into like the specifics of my book, but the last like third of it is dealing with my own sense of despair as formerly an SJP, Student for Justice in Palestine, activist on campus. As I was just starting to come into sort of a political awareness in the United States, I actually fell victim to a lot of the perfect victim sort of like frameworks. I felt very institutionally, my group and I felt very institutionally boxed in. We spent a lot of time in dialogue, we spent a lot of time in appeasement, we spent a lot of time allowing ourselves to be dehumanized, to try to make comfortable our oppressors. So there's a lot of those sort of traps. Those are, I think one lesson that I learned along the way is how many places our energy and our hope gets sapped. So again, these are all so strategic and so intentional. So I will say that I did come to a point of despair. And at the end of the book, I sort of talk about despair as a point of potential, because at the point of despair is the point where we recognize the world that we live in falling short of the world that we deserve, and that we should listen really intensely to our despair. I actually just recently read a quote by Mohammad Tarbush, who said that the voice of despair is stronger than the voice of hope. Because, you know, he said he came to be the voice of Troy. You know, we have Homer's myths about the victories of the winning side, right? But we didn't have a Homer for Troy. Troy is just cast as the defeated. But what if the quote-unquote defeated got to speak? So that is one reason why spaces like this are so important, because the louder we get, the more undeniable we are. And then what do we do when we are speaking? What do we do to push back against the despair? I think protest is so important, rage is so important, fighting is so important, but I think that, again, this panel is a great reminder of what we're fighting for. It needs to be centered, life needs to be centered. We need to continue to find ways to work towards building the world in small and large ways that we want to arrive at once we cross that horizon. So all that to say, invest in the beauty of Palestinians, highlight the beauty of Palestinians, not in the simplistic way of trying to convince others that we are human, but what are they trying the hardest to steal from us? Not just as Palestinians, but as just all sorts of oppressed people. Let us never lose sight of the world that we know we deserve, the people that we know that we are, that they constantly try to distract from, to steal and erase in every sort of way. You know, as our colleague said, let us create an archive of the now and the future in everything that we do. I think that there's just like a profound hope in allowing our imagination not to avoid despair or resist it with sort of a stiff arm, but to welcome in sort of what that heartbreak is saying and sort of the shape of the world that it is teaching us we were born for and we desire. So those are very abstract, idealistic maybe, but I think there's also so many ways that each of us probably in our deep, heart of hearts know that it can take shape. So I apologize if that was too abstract. More practical colleagues will speak now.
It was great.
Say something a bit more concrete.
I'm being asked that we have to stop now.
Very brief. 2 words.
I'm sorry, I took up that space.
Very brief.
You can count them. Count the words.
I'm not counting.
Okay. About protesting and not having hope and losing hope, all of that. Edward Said once said, if you stop telling the story, it will just drop and disappear. So the idea is to keep talking about Palestine, keep protesting. Isabella Hamad said, despair is not ethical. Mahmoud Darwish said, we nurture hope. I wrote a book before this one called Imagining Palestine, and it was about hope. So in order to create a culture of resistance to counter the manufactured consent of Western hegemonic media, we must counter with resistance, with hope, and not with despair. Despair is unethical, period.
so much for coming, and thank you to all our wonderful authors. They're so eloquent, absolutely brilliant books.